Have you ever wondered about the most expensive albums ever made? We're not just talking about the cost of studio time or production. We're delving into the lavish, the utterly foolish, and the downright jaw-dropping expenses that went into creating these intended musical masterpieces. It's never been more affordable to record an album as it is today. With high-quality equipment available to the masses, artists can spend as much time as they want without the spectre of a daily or even hourly rate on their mind. Of course, it wasn't always like that. And back in the day, to get the best recordings, you needed the best studios, producers, and musicians around. And this, of course, cost money. Serious money that could bankrupt labels, end careers, and sometimes, amazingly, actually pay off. In the late 1950s, the cost of producing pop albums was around $3,000 to $7,000. This climbed sharply to $15,000 in the 60s, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band broke the mold in 1967 when the Beatles spent 5.5 months in the studio at a cost of around £40,000. This seemed like a bargain compared to the Beach Boys album Pet Sounds, which cost $70,000. Brian Wilson was a big proponent of the studio as an instrument philosophy, which meant long recording sessions with the top musicians of the day like the Wrecking Crew. The Who matched this then astronomical sum, recording their rock opera Tommy, spending nearly a year recording and re-recording songs to produce a lavish double album. The Beach Boys intended to follow up Pet Sounds with the album Smile, although this didn't get released until 2012, after being shelved in 1967 due to Brian Wilson's mental issues. It's estimated that the album had already exceeded the budget of Pet Sounds by this stage, due to some quite bizarre requests from Wilson, including a $30,000 Arabian tent built for the consumption of inspirational substances and sandwiches. He also had his piano placed in a sandbox filled with 8 tons of premium beach sand so he could feel the sand between his toes while recording. The 70s saw an increase in recording indulgences, and by the end of the decade, Fleetwood Mac's album Tusk became the first $1 million album. In fact, it was more like $1.4 million, making it the most expensive album recorded to that date. I imagine the bulk of this cost was due to the band creating their own studio room at the Village Recorders studio in LA. Studio D was constructed especially for them, with Stevie Nicks requesting a vocal booth looking like a sunset in Tahiti. Disappointingly for the band though, the album didn't do as well as the previous offering, Rumours, and was seen as a failure. It did become a cult classic over time though, so it did come good in the end. As the 80s got into its full pomp, million-dollar album costs were commonplace, and it wasn't long before the 5 million mark was surpassed with the release of Def Leppard's Hysteria album. The album's goal, set out by producer Mutt Lange, was to be a hard rock version of Michael Jackson's Thriller, in that every track was a potential hit single. Songs were therefore written with this concept in mind, and were recorded and re-recorded many times until they'd achieved their goal. Using the latest technology available, including Fairlight samplers costing a whopping $65,000 each, they were able to perfect each sound to their exact desires. This whole process ended up taking them 3 years to complete, and the album remains the most expensive ever made in the UK. Hysteria did go on to dominate album charts around the world for 3 years, and was certified 12 times platinum by 1998. So it seems like this fastidious approach did actually pay off. Towards the end of the 80s and into the 90s, it was finally time for Michael Jackson to get spending some of that Thriller money, although his follow-up album Bad only cost a modest $2 million to make. But his 1991 offering Dangerous easily eclipsed this with a total production cost of over $10 million. For nearly 2 years, starting in late 1989, recording took place primarily at Ocean Way Record 1 in LA, with Michael block booking the studio at a cost of $4,000 per day. The initial recording was overseen by Brian Lauren, and nearly a whole album was in the can before Jackson had decided it wasn't up to his usual standard, and he was looking for something more aggressive and urban after being inspired by his sister Janet's album Rhythm Nation. After reaching out to producers Antonio L.A. Reid and Kenny Babyface Edmonds, in June 1990, Jackson actually hired Teddy Riley, pioneer of the New Jack Swing genre. By then, Jackson had already recorded over 50 songs, which rose to 70 when the album was finally finished after over 2 years of work. The anticipation for the release was so high that 5 days before the album's release, 3 men armed with guns robbed 30,000 copies from a Los Angeles warehouse. His follow-up album History also reportedly cost $10 million to make. But the most mind-blowing fiscal fact about this album is that the video for the lead track Scream, a duet with his sister Janet, cost an eye-watering world record $7 million to make, due to its elaborate use of computer-generated graphics, which could probably be done on a smartphone today. Back on the other side of the pond, a new wave of bands mixing the emerging dance culture scene with guitars and drums was taking over and become big business. The Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses were the zenith of this particular movement, and Geffen didn't waste time snapping up the Stone Roses to provide a home for their second album. This ended up taking a number of years to get together and was mostly welcomed on its release despite not living up to its title or their previous work. The Happy Mondays follow-up to Thrills, Pills and Bellyaches, Yes Please, was an unmitigated disaster that bankrupted their label Factory and split the band. Tony Wilson somehow authorised these Salford lads to jet off to Barbados to record with the Talking Heads duo Chris Frantz and Tina Weymouth. At the time, Shaun Ryder was a recovering heroin addict and unfortunately smashed his bottle of methadone before they even left the airport, and their destination was the world's #1 centre for crack. The recording dragged on as members of the band started selling the studio equipment to buy more drugs. The chaos continued with Shaun running an improvised poolside crack den and Bears crashing multiple cars. When Wilson finally got a hold of the tapes, there were no vocals recorded, which meant yet more sessions. The resultant album made the top 20, but the first single, Stinkin' Thinkin', only made number 31, and the second, Sunshine and Love, didn't even make the top 40. The album was issued a few weeks before Factory had to file for bankruptcy, and remains the final release on the original label. Inevitably, it was also a critical flop, with the Melody Makers' reply to the title Yes Please being, no thanks. One band doing much better at this time were Guns N' Roses. In 1991, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 and The Spaghetti Incident were big sellers, and after the end of the tour finishing in 1993, work got underway for the follow-up. However, several members left following creative and personal differences with Axl Rose, and no music was released. After a long hiatus, work finally resumed with lead singer Axl Rose getting together a new lineup. Demand for the album was high, and no expense was spared in getting the best possible results, with salaries of $11,000 a month for each musician, $25,000 a month for the recording software engineer, and $50,000 a month for the studio. The record company hoped to get the album out by March 1999 and offered Axl a finishing bonus of $1 million as an incentive. The only parts that were completed in '99 were the vocals, as instrumental parts had to be constantly re-recorded, with the band fast becoming a revolving door of members coming and going. Queen's Brian May even recorded some guitar solos for the album, but they didn't make the final mix. At one point, the band was using a budget of almost $250,000 a month. Axl even re-recorded their biggest album, Appetite for Destruction, with the new band members during these sessions. The album was finally released in November 2008, and the recording of it spanned over a decade. The album's production cost was reportedly over $13 million, making it the most expensive rock album ever produced. Needless to say, the album didn't live up to the hype and anticipation, and even the supporting tour was a disaster, with cancellations and riots marring the whole affair. From hard rock to the world of pop, this one couldn't have gone much worse for the label and artist. Virgin Records had enjoyed huge success with the band The Spice Girls in the 90s, and despite the eventual breakup of the band, they weren't keen on letting that particular cash cow go easily. Signing Victoria Beckham seemed like a no-brainer to the record company bigwigs, as her profile was huge at the time, especially in the UK. And no expense was spared, hiring high-profile producers of the day, including Damon Dash, Rockwilder, and Soulshock and Carlin. The cost eventually racked up to around $5 million by the time of the release. And Virgin again spared no expense with its promotion. All they had to do now was sit back and watch the sales rack up. Except they didn't. Only selling 50,000 copies in the UK. The album was a disaster, although it wasn't without some success, with the single Out of My Mind going to number 2 in the UK charts. This wasn't enough though to save Vicky's solo music career, as no more solo records have emerged since. The following year, in 2002, the American nu metal band Korn were riding high and splashed out $4 million to record their album Untouchables. The band spent 2 years recording the follow-up to Issues, and during this time, the band generously kept their entire 15-man crew on a retainer and splashing out on houses for the band and engineers. Recording the vocals alone took almost 6 months. This meticulous approach paid off commercially though, as the record went on to sell over 5 million copies across the world. Country star Garth Brooks had been the king of his genre for some time by the end of the 90s, but despite all the success, he felt he needed to branch out into the rock and pop world. To make this transition, Brooks invented a character to play with an elaborate backstory. The character was Chris Gaines, a tormented and very successful pop musician who was seeking redemption for his debauched lifestyle following a near-death car wreck. The album was intended to be a soundtrack for a movie, although this movie was never made. Not surprisingly, given the reaction from the fans who are confused and possibly alienated by the entire project. Costing around $5 million in total, it failed so spectacularly, it seems even Garth Brooks himself would love it if the whole thing could just be forgotten. It's long out of print, and amazingly, the music from the album has even been deleted from YouTube, so you can forget trying to get hold of a digital download. The 2000s really saw the last of the big spenders, as the music business went into freefall in the wake of file-sharing sites such as Napster and LimeWire. But one artist wasn't finished yet, and released his and the world's most expensive album. Michael Jackson's last album, Invincible, was released in October 2001 by Epic Records, and cost a staggering $30 million. It was started in 1997, and wasn't completed until 8 weeks before its release, 4 years later. The release was backed up with $25 million in marketing costs, and despite this huge amount, Jackson felt the album wasn't given priority, and tension grew between the artist and label. So much so that Jackson refused to support the album with a tour. Most of the $30 million spent came out of Jackson's own pocket, and his lavish spending didn't stop there, with bankruptcy nearly catching up with him before his untimely death in 2009. It's unlikely we'll see spending like this on music making again anytime soon, but it was really interesting to find out just how much money was floating around in those days. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this soon. Thank you for watching.